and tribunals in India and various international tribunals. He regularly acts for international defense companies, telecom and broadcasting, infrastructure majors and funds and commercial banks. Ashish regularly advises on numerous corruption and white collar issues and has been representing clients in the largest anti-corruption cases in the country, including the Rafael case. So Ashish, welcome, and I'll turn it over to you in a minute. But Ashish is also joined by Drew Hruska from King and Spalding, who focuses on criminal and regulatory litigation and investigation, complex civil and bankruptcy litigation, and internal investigations. He's a partner in the special matters and investigation practice at King and Spalding and represents major financial service and industrial companies in enforcement of investigation and other matters. Drew represents a variety of financial service clients, including securities, banking, insurance, hedge funds, and private equity funds, as well as in enforcement investigations by government agencies, including the Department of Justice, the SEC, state attorneys generals, and many others. So he is an expert at the investigations. So with that, and Ashish, thank you so much for joining us today. I did mention that we're recording this so we can share it with others who weren't able to join today. We'll also our social media platforms so that we can kind of spread the word. So you're on the record, and thank you very much. Ashish, I'm going to turn it over to you to give some framing remarks on sort of what companies can think about and sort of some of the issues that you've seen unfolding, particularly in your representation of Rafael. So over to you first.
Thank you. I mean, it's a pleasure being with all of you today. I think let me start by saying that a lot has changed from the time when India started doing, large procurement defense deals maybe 10, 12 years ago. We've had a significant change in the regime where a lot of emphasis is laid on the procurement process to be clean and to make sure that there is no illegal activity that happens around procurement. Traditionally, I think, and I don't think it's completely out of the picture today, but these large defense deals tend to be a little political in nature, so which makes it a little sensitive in general for the quality of the country. So these are sensitive deals when you're looking at larger deals. But a lot also happens where people are not talking of the large procurement of, say, fighter jets or missiles or submarines, etc. But there is a lot of procurement at a lower end of the market also, which is extremely essential for general defense procurements in the country. So, I think the government in the last 10, 15 years has realized that, look, we can't have a blanket way of dealing with everybody. There are issues that need to be resolved, and that's the reason why our DPP, which is the Defense Procurement Policy, has been revised over a period of time, and what it looked like in 2008 significantly changed to what it looks like in 2020. So I think it's a welcome step, but I guess given the nature of the industry, it still has one of those things which creates issues around procurement. I think one of the larger issues is, if at all there is any contravention or if there is an allegation of a contravention, I think, the first way to deal with it from an Indian government perspective is, okay, we'll put a stop to dealing with you. So either it will be an express suspension or an express debarment, or it will be an implied where the government is not looking at you at all. So that's one of the things that whether it's one government or the other from the past, everybody has been dealing with it in the same fashion. And as I said, given that it becomes politically sensitive, so everyone treads on this issue very carefully. But I think the larger impact of this is on the business of these companies, because look, you could be talking of a small procurement in the defense side from one of your subsidiaries, and there are allegations of illegal bribery, etc., and the whole group suffers. I think that's one of the things that we've been debating a lot with the government, that what is the connection that we have to keep drawing, and can this go on to parent entities? Can this go on to, you blacklisting all connected entities? So, what is the way we need to deal with this? I mean, there has to be a little more commercial thought process than a political or an emotional, reaction to it many times. So I think one of the things that we've been really talking, we've been at least trying to speak at various forums is, look, let the entity be debarred, let there be punishments, let there be penalties. But this excessive debarment and suspension is not good for the company, not good for the country, not good for the competition. And at times, many significant players, just because one of their subsidiaries has been involved or there's been allegation or something, is unable to participate in a larger tender. So does that impact the quality of equipment that you may be getting eventually at a future date? The unfortunately, the problem in the Indian legal system is that, if there is a suspension or if there is a debarment, the courts take their own time. So it takes a while before all these actions, suspension orders are revoked, or if there is an intervention from the court. So essentially, it could be a small, allegation of some illegal activity, and you could be debarred for 5 years. Now, whether that's legally sustainable or not is obviously debatable, because there are cases where some of these are not sustainable. But given the nature of how sensitive this issue is, none of the bureaucrats or none of the people who are decision makers want to really uh, take it upon themselves and revoke the suspension order unless there are instances where we can get a court order. In fact, we've had instances where we've had interactions with some of these officials, and what we've heard from them is, I know we should be taking a more reasonable approach, but our hands are tied because we are in a system of government procurement, and you might as well get an order from the court. So we are actually running from pillar to post to get it, the order revoked. So many times, I think that's one of the key areas that we need to work on more regularly. That is there a better way to deal with it? Is there a way of, say, a deferred prosecution agreement? That's something in the US. We don't have that in India. Can we look at that? Is there a way to not, have a policy of blacklisting so stringent that it fails the commercial rationale of any big, defense company business in India? So is there a way where we can impose, the government can look at imposing heavier penalties, but keep the field open, and so that the government is at least able to get enough competition and make sure that all the players are there in the market. So that's one of our suggestions that we've been trying to look at many times in our interactions with the government, that look, we can also consider these deferred prosecution agreements like in the US. It's more business friendly. It allows people to make sure that they don't get away even if there is an allegation. The problem today in India is that the government has the power to suspend you on a mere allegation. So it's not that there is a full-blown trial that's concluded and somebody has found a company guilty of an illegal action or bribery, etc. A mere allegation or something that comes in the press, which kind of creates an uproar in within the opposition or politically, it can lead to decision making of suspension, blacklisting, banning, temporary or permanent. Now that's a bit unfair at times because there is no adjudication on this, and given that they have the power to do so, they some of the officers or some of the agencies may think that it's better to do it and make it more at least cover themselves so that there are no questions asked today. So, that's the first step that they take. And that's kind of unfortunate because then to reverse that step takes a long time in India. So I think the fact that they have the power to suspend pending full inquiry is something that is extremely critical. We've been talking about it a lot, that look, we shouldn't be looking at suspension. Suspensions should be done for the rare cases or the cases which require that kind of adverse action. I think more dialogue, penalties, compounding of offenses is something that you can consider. But just a knee jerk and suspending, okay, I'm temporarily banning you, not talking to you, that may not be the best outcome for either the government or for uh, corporations who are looking to do business in India. I think it also goes against the current flavor of what the government is trying to do these days. If you're trying to bring in international investments, if you're looking at, making your country open to global uh, companies, then, such strict regime kind of, puts a thought in the company's mind that, is India a safer place to go in? Will I get stuck there? And I think, let me be fair, we've covered some ground, but I think there's still more to be done. Uh, there's definitely been a change. There's definitely been some bit of comfort that I see in the market. But I think, it's still at a very high level when you're talking of, G2G deals, where you're talking of governments looking at other governments, but what gets lost in the whole process are smaller deals, smaller procurement issues, because the government is not really dealing with those. So I think just the openness of the government on that is something that we are looking forward to. I think defense again continues to be a strategically important aspect of the political thought process in India. At least that's what we hear time and again from the government. So I do sense that something is going to change. I think just on that point, one of the things that did change in 2020 was how the regime from banning of agents changed to allowing agents to be there and just making sure there are disclosures about these agents. I think agents in India have always been the bigger problematic issues for historically from the 90s. I think we've had enough political and commercial disputes on this, and a lot of time and efforts have been wasted over the years on what are these agents, what are their roles, what should they be doing. It was a very hush hush affair. I think the DPP in 2020, just to regulating the whole process, how to have agents and keep having them, giving them the ability, giving companies the ability to disclose that, look, these are the agents, this is what they're going to do, is a welcome step. I think it's a step that we all have been working for many years. I think at whatever possible forums where we've been able to talk, this is an issue that we've spoken about a lot. That, look, the role of the agents, of course, should be regulated, but to just say that you can't use one is a bit arbitrary. So, it's something that has found favor with the government, and I think it's a good step that the government has taken. But yeah, I mean, there are things like what we were talking about on suspension that, look, that's something that the government still needs to think of how and when to bring in the right kind of changes. I think they also have to keep in mind that the judicial system in India is not as quick as the other parts of the world. So, any adverse action that happens at the very instant takes time to be reversed. So keeping that in mind, we've seen cases where people have been blacklisted for 5 years and eventually they've fought a legal battle for 10 years and eventually they've been out of the market for 10 years. And 10 years is too long a period of time for anybody to bounce back. So quite frankly, I think that's the most important other aspect that we've been talking about. So, interestingly, in some of these defense contracts and in the integrity pacts, there are these previous transgression clauses which talks about, have you been blacklisted for the last 3 years? Now, if I have been blacklisted for 5 years, then I'm still barred in that in under that clause to say if you've been barred for the last 3 years, you're transgressed, so you can't participate. So essentially, a 5-year ban extends to an 8-year ban. I mean, that may not be the correct way of reading it, but unfortunately, many times agencies don't want to look at you because you've been blacklisted in the past. So there's that, historical legacy issue that continues with the blacklisting, and therefore I think it continues to become one of the most important and critical issues in the defense industry. I think one of the most you know evolved things over the last 5-6 years has been that the courts have taken some of these things very seriously, and not so much in the defense industry side, but on just general procurement issues in the country. A lot of these tender related litigations have come up in the country, whether it's on banning somebody or having an unreasonable position taken by the government qua some of the contractors or the OEMs. The courts have been a little more active than before. They've been a little more relief granting than before, which is a welcome step. The unfortunate part of the defense industry in the court system really is that the government can come back and take just one argument, and which is, oh, this has an issue of national security, and then the courts actually just withdraw. So
Right.
they have this magic thing in their pocket that if they want to push it in the judicial process, they'll come back and say this involves national security. And we saw that in most of
Yeah.
the big ticket litigations that have happened in the defense side in the last 10 years. So that's something that the government has to reluctantly use in the future, because if they continue to use this, some of the bigger players will lose interest in the market. So in the judicial.
Ashish, that's interesting that you talk a little bit about the court system, because I think once you're in the court system, your hands are tied and everyone's at that point realizing you're in for a multi-year battle, right? I think your points in the former about, not getting blacklisted in the first place and the threshold for that, the sort of, how bureaucrats tend towards leaning towards that, just to be a conservative judgment, I think are all important. And we should talk about, even though it sounds like there's some steps in the right direction, what sort of other things the industry can do to empower bureaucrats and others to not take that initial step in the first place, because that, is the kind of domino that falls and causes all these other things. I do want to pause here and turn it over to Drew, because I want him to react a little bit to what you said, but also, Drew, I know you have some thoughts on the work that you're doing here in the US, but also maybe what you're seeing around the world in other jurisdictions as well. How does maybe India compare to other jurisdictions? But importantly, how are US suppliers looking at issues like this? Does it give them trepidation entering in the market? How probably I could say, that US defense companies are probably some of the top tier companies in the world in terms of ensuring that there is no bribery and there is no issues. But of course, issues happen, especially with their suppliers. So what sort of advice do you give to the US companies when they're working with suppliers in other countries like India? What sort of issues are you seeing here in the US and around the world?
Well, thank you, Amy, and I'm pleased to speak with such a distinguished group. I'm glad that we have in some sense, I'm glad we have such a select group today on the call video, because I'm happy, as I know Ashish is, to take questions at any time, and please feel free to interrupt me if you have anything or want to add a point. I was interested, I thought Ashish's presentation is very interesting, and I kept thinking that it was perversely gratifying to learn that there was another government whose defense procurement system is as forbidding and punitive and seemingly arbitrary as the American government. Because a lot of what you're saying, Ashish, is unfortunately very reminiscent of the cases that we have here. And I have done a number of cases involving U.S. defense procurement, and there are some similarities. I have done a fair amount of work with regard to India in the financial sector and the energy sector, doing investigations there on a number of occasions. I've done a fair amount of work in the defense industry on a number of issues. I've never had the overlap between the two, although, as you point out, Amy, it's not difficult to imagine how that might occur. Obviously, India has a well-developed and very focused system of examining corruption issues that Ashish has just spent some time talking about. The United States also has a well-developed system, and we do think a lot about what we call foreign corruption issues in an effort to police companies, not just American companies, but companies that have some overlap with the United States in terms of their dealings abroad. So one of the first things one thinks about in any defense procurement situation is exactly that. Was there a corrupt influence? And whether or not there is domestic interest, that is, in our hypothetical, whether there's an Indian enforcement interest in a particular defense procurement situation, there may also be an American interest. I will say that there has been an increasing amount of coordination between authorities in various places, so that it now is more the norm than the exception, that we're dealing with a scenario where more than one government's enforcement authorities are involved, and that there is some degree of coordination between them, which I think heightens the risk for companies, not that the risk wasn't already fairly high. And so I think as U.S. companies approach India, they have to bear that in mind. This is a well-developed system, which especially in the area of government procurement, defense procurement, is going to pay very close attention to anti-corruption issues, and that there could be a U.S. analog to that. The U.S. may very well get interested in that situation. You don't have to imagine too much to see how it would happen. I mean, for instance, just 2 years ago, really on the eve of all of the COVID restrictions kicking in and people's attention being directed elsewhere, Airbus, the European conglomerate, entered into a resolution of bribery allegations, admitting them, and paid really a staggering amount of money. Something, I mean, when you total up all the fines, it was, I think, in the neighborhood of like $7 billion or euro, some to the European authorities and then also some to the United States Justice Department, despite the fact that Airbus is not an American headquartered company. It nonetheless had sufficient overlap with the United States for that to become an enforcement issue. And then on top of that, what I wanted to add, and what's particularly relevant from an American perspective, is the violations of U.S. sanctions regulations, in that case, the ITAR regulations. I think it'd be interesting to talk about that as well, because I think those two issues are increasingly going hand in hand. They're not natural partners necessarily as issues go, but I think the United States government is starting to see them as closer and closer together. And to start on a functional level, and this may be interesting to the audience, inside the U.S. government, there's starting to be much more communication across bureaucratic lines about marrying up the enforcement of sanctions issues, anti-corruption, kleptocracy, and all of those together. We now in the U.S. are particularly focused on sanctions. I think there is some relevance to the U.S.-Indian trade situation. Those who are following the international press right now are, of course, focused on the confrontation with Russia, between Russia and the West, Western Europe, the United States, and the ripple effects that's having on world trade. I know a lot of focus is right now on Ukraine, and that seems very far away, both from the U.S. and from India. But you can see how this is playing out. As the trend, at least, is that the U.S. and the West are forcing a greater division in the world between trading blocs, and the sanctions, both financial and munitions sanctions, are going to be used as a wedge. And I think the natural progression is that the world will be divided between a European American bloc and a Chinese Russian bloc. And I realize that leaves India in an awkward position, especially given the long-standing defense relationship with Russia. India, I've always thought India is America's natural ally. We both have very, highly educated populace, a lot of similar interest, democratic system, mutual antipathy toward China, and yet there are these issues that are going to be awkward forcing issues, and it's not difficult to see how the sanctions question could come up as it becomes more and more difficult for countries to trade at an intense level, and certainly at a level involving sophisticated military equipment with both Russia and the NATO countries. I know that became an issue under the so-called CATSA sanctions that came in 2014. India has continually gotten waivers from that, but that's a matter of legislative grace, so to speak. It's not guaranteed, and it would be easily rescinded, and that I think would put the U.S.-India defense trade relationship in an awkward position. Some of the fines on sanctions issues can be quite severe. There's just last month, there was a fairly small company that was trading optical devices to China that had dual-use military applications, paid nearly $1 million fine. I know $1 million in the context of defense doesn't sound huge, but it was a small company, and believe me, this is starting to be a laser beam-like focus for U.S. enforcement. I could talk a lot more about corruption issues. I gather from the membership here that everybody's probably fairly sophisticated about that. It's obviously difficult to deal in India. I think Ashish is 100% right that most of the advice I give around India has to do with the use of agents and how opaque or transparent that use is. It's always a challenge to figure out exactly what the agents are doing. It's always required, I think, for American companies to document agent activity in a very disciplined way. I've received too many government investigations to count, including criminal investigations, most often about the use of agents, and the level of expectation at the American enforcement agencies, especially the Justice Department, is quite high when it comes to what they see as the necessary precautions in dealing in agency situations, and just how intimately they expect the company to understand what activity and what expenses the agent is taking on their behalf. It's really a world different from, say, a decade ago, where having a reasonable program in place, having a compliance program, and having the ability to audit was often seen as sufficient. It's not anymore. The bar has really gone up dramatically. I could go on in that vein for a while. I think it's worth noting that there are also some other concerns. The industry, the defense industry, is obviously not immune to allegations of cartel activity and bid rigging. There have been a couple of large settlements in that regard recently, and that can't be entirely written off. I think that what once seemed to be the impenetrable aspects of dealing in India, and I think Ashish was right on this. That's changing a bit. India is no longer quite as forbidding a place for American investment. There's been a lot of positive activity on the Indian side to support that, but it's still seen as a difficult place to operate. There's as a place where there's a web of restrictions, including in some situations the need to have JV partners, and especially dealing with the Indian government. So I think a lot more could be done in that respect to help things along. I think it will be done. I think that's the natural progression, and the issues that we're pointing out are ones that are to be worked through and can be worked through with some mutual understanding. So that's my high level observation. I'm really, like I said at the beginning, I'm really happy to take questions on any of this. I was asked to keep it fairly high level and not be citing code sections or anything like that. But if you want to get into the details, then we should start that discussion.
Thanks, Drew. I definitely will I'm going to turn it over to some folks here in a second to take some questions. Before I do that, though, what would be your sort of like one or two, and then I'm going to turn back to Ashish for this similar question. What would be your sort of one or two practical pieces of advice that you would give a senior executive of a defense company when they're and either entering or maybe partnering with a new supplier in India? If you had to sort of just give them a headline, what would you sort of recommend or say to them?
I would say really understand who your partners are and what they're going to do. Don't accept paper representations, but have some real live on the ground feeling for what's going to happen, and make sure that there are audit rights embodied in your agreement so that it's possible to keep that live understanding fresh, not just at the moment you get the contract, but on an ongoing basis. It's those kinds of bona fide transparency requirements that are really something that will help satisfy and resolve any inquiries that you get from the U.S. side going forward. And in attention to those issues and a tendency to say, well, once you have the contract, it's all done, no worries. That's what kind of gets people into trouble.
Got it. Ashish, let me turn it back to you for a second. I wanted to ask you a kind of a follow-on question and then a separate question. The first is on tendering. I think we've seen more of a movement towards e-tendering and online tendering. You and others on the call might have more experience on that, but has that been helpful in minimizing some of these corruption issues, potentially on bid rigging and other issues, or are you still seeing it play out, even though there's supposed to be more transparency by having this done in an online forum?
So other than the fact that some of these e-tenders, there are allegations at times that, some of these, the time of submission and all those things are not very smooth. I think the e-tenders have been very, very successful. It has obviously, to a large extent, taken out the issue of bid rigging in India. I haven't heard of a case in the last 5, 7, or 8 years where of a at least a big ticket case of bid rigging. I think the process has become very, very interactive. And just to bring back what Andrew was saying, that transparency is becoming a very important factor in India. And I think just to other than the tendering process, but just general transparency where the partners have easy access to all documents. There's enough conversation around it. There's also systematic presentations made at the right forums transparently to explore business opportunity is something that a lot of that is happening in India in the last couple of years. So I think the e-tendering has been a fairly successful model by the government till now.
Good. Well, I'm happy to hear that, and hopefully that will continue to create transparency and sort of more trust in the system, because I know that inherently there has been a lot of mistrust. I guess then a follow up before I start to open it, and I did want to see if Partha wanted to ask a question from Lockheed or Ali from Jacobs, but let me ask one more question, Ashish. So Drew talked a little bit about sort of what advice he would give U.S. companies coming in, either with a new supplier or into a new system. I wanted to sort of see from your perspective on the ground, what are suppliers as they look to sort of sophisticating their a more sophisticated relationship, going up the value chain. Are they ready for these types of responsibilities and contracts? And is there an understanding, or is more work to be done to sort of create the expectation with some of these suppliers and others that are going to help on these defense contracts?
I think, it's much better, but I think the expectation setting still needs to be at a level where, at least the international suppliers know what market they are getting into and what are the finer issues that exist in India. A lot of times in the past, all these deals that happened with the suppliers, the local knowledge was limited. But today, I think, given the fact that a lot of them are there in the market, they've sort of burned their hands at times. They've been successful, so they know some of it. That look, when you're dealing with India, you have to know two things. And as we were discussing, that how clearly are our contracts drafted? How clearly are our conditions there? Is it a one-sided contract? Unfortunately, when you're dealing with the government, most of these contracts are one-sided. What is the scope of further negotiation? I think in the last 7, 8 years, we've seen a lot of, I think the governments mostly have been acceptable to the fact that if we are bringing in something exclusive for them on the table, if we're talking of setting up industries in India, if we're talking of job creation, if we're talking of transferring of technology or investing in R&D in India, I think the government has been very, very welcome. So, keeping the local flavor in mind, I think in the last, at least in this political regime, Make in India was a big thing, and therefore, there have been some failure stories, but I can assure you that there have been many success stories where we've seen the government respond very proactively on issues where the companies are willing to bring something fruitful on the table, which allows local market to develop. I think that's one of the keys today that alongside just supplying, if there is activity which allows research and development for the country as such, I think the government is welcoming such steps from the corporations globally.
Well, that's good to hear, I guess. So we'll continue to hope that, the situation improves, that I think we can all work certainly on the legal side to help handhold and educate some of the suppliers as they get more mature and work with some of these international defense companies. Let me open it up. Anyone at any time can just use the raise hand function to ask a question. So let me go ahead and open it up. And I might call on Keith first, if Partha doesn't want to ask a question. Keith, I know you do work, if I can, internationally, representing the defense companies. I don't know if you have any other thoughts that you want to add into this as well.
No, I think, as was discussed on the Indian side, it's such a severe move, even without clear evidence. Just the hint or concern of a possibility results in such a difficult situation that lasts for such a long period of time, that if there was any way to accelerate the exploratory process or reinvent some of that so it could move more quickly to release, if you will, those who have not done wrong, so that we could move forward, would be ideal. I think that's my initial reaction.
Yeah, I think we ought to use this on that very question.
Amy, we're having a very hard time. We're having a hard time hearing you, or at least I am.
Let's see, 1 second. Okay, how's that? Better? Okay.
Yeah.
I was saying just, I think this is a good chance to, use this meeting to really think about what sort of recommendations we could make to the government to allow them to sort of, as you said, start that exploratory process without, causing too many issues. And if they get caught up in allegations, how we ensure that gets resolved quickly so that the process can move forward without sort of getting caught up in all the bureaucracy and the politics, potentially the courts and everything else, that the deal then completely stalls out, right? So I think, why don't we, Pushan, use this as a chance to maybe brainstorm a little bit and see if we can't come up with some recommendations. We can either present those recommendations in a letter or a meeting with the government on ideas that we think, might move the needle forward a little bit on this, just as one idea. I don't see any other hands raised. I don't know if there's any other questions from the group. I did see someone on with a phone line too, who maybe now dropped. But if you're on the phone and you can't raise your hand, you can chime in too. All right, well, what I may do then is I think we might wrap up. As I said, I'm going to use this as a springboard to sort of reconvene, the group and sort of see if we can't come up with some recommendations. Drew and Ashish, not to put too much burden on your time, but maybe using you to sort of review and provide your wise counsel to any recommendations that we come up would be helpful. So we'd love to stay engaged with you as we sort of go about this exercise. And then, as I said, I'd love to be able to share tidbits of this conversation. We're going to do it privately with sending this recording out to the membership, but also on social media to see if we can't come up with some other ideas, maybe get those who weren't aware of this meeting to join us and also brainstorm on this. But I think we're all, passionate and committed to making sure the U.S. defense industry, U.S.-India defense industry is more closely tied, aligned, and working together. And so if we can find ways to ensure that the suppliers and other, tenders and deals are moving forward and don't get caught up in unintended, consequences, still respecting the very important reason that these provisions are created and ensuring that the people who are doing wrong are not taking advantage of the system, I think will be really important. So let me just see, Ashish or Drew, do you have any final comments for everyone before we wrap up?
So I just, sorry, just one last point which I sort of missed making earlier was, it's an often ignored strategy, but the media perception in India is a big issue these days. So having a very tight media strategy for larger corporations globally is very, very important. I think over the last few years, media has become an extremely important aspect of how politics and other things are run and perceptions are changed in the country. I think I think the defense industry needs to do a little more in terms of how the perception changes, so the media strategy becomes extremely relevant in today's day and age. I think, many times we've only heard negative media when something happens wrong or when there is a political angle to it. But, it's hardly a scenario where you hear positive media on defense procurements and something, substantial. I think it's mostly something that we should consider working more closely with some of the top agencies to ensure that, the perceptions around the countries are cleared and things have become, and at least the general public gets a good sense of how the industry is moving. I think in India, Indian people are generally very emotional. So, the whole fact of reaching out is what is extremely important. I think not like any commercial media management, but a very strategic media management for the industry is extremely important.
And I would just add somewhat along the lines of what Ashish was saying. Not only is media in India important, but given the interconnectedness of the world, that media is going to be all over. It's going to be in the United States. It's going to be in other places in the neighborhood. So it's important not only to be aware of public perceptions across borders, but also to take lessons from what happens in various places. American and European defense industry companies need to look at what happens in one country and try to use imagination to see how that might happen somewhere else, especially as the U.S.-Indian trade relationship grows and expands in the defense sector. So.
Yeah, if I could just add, I think the challenge that I had working with industry when I was in the Pentagon and India on the DTTI, is that we really were cautious, extremely cautious with any media campaign, and really in partnership with the MOD and MFA for two reasons. One, there was always that sensitivity to, is this an alliance, or are the Americans pushing for an alliance? So we were always walking on eggshells, not to be too public, not to be too official, and certainly not to be heavy into the media, not doing op-eds or anything like that as government officials. So there's that whole alliance issue that has to be dealt with. And then the second point that I think is important to remember is this whole issue of corruption or fear of even finger pointing towards corruption really causes paralysis in the acquisition process in India. For fear of that last person who has to sign an authorization as a government official, and then there's some sort of political blow up about corruption, even unfounded, would be the end of that official's career. So, looking at ways to build confidence within the government acquisition system that enables layering such that there are protections and checks and balances so that bureaucrats feel a bit more protected, and as well as any appropriate media campaign, as well as maybe modifying the judicial process to be more expedient. All of that, I think, is needed simultaneously.
I think, let's see if I think all good points, Keith, on the sensitivity and ensuring that as we go about on the messaging, we're mindful of other effects that messaging may have, and the sensitivities to it are all well taken. So thank you for that. I want to thank Drew and Ashish for joining us today, providing your insight and advice on this. I really see this as a start to, I think, some more conversations on this topic, and hopefully some ideas on how we might move the needle forward. So I appreciate you planting the seed today and allowing us to take this forward, and for giving your time. So thanks again. Have a good evening from those of you in India, and good morning and rest of your day from those from the US. Thanks again. Be well, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you. Bye. Bye.